Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
Welcome to Stuff I'll Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And today we are so thrilled to bring you yet another interview. We are so lucky we get to talk to amazing people.
One of my favorite parts of this.
And they're experts in their fields. It's just amazing. And I've been pretty happy. We've started the year off strong with some good interviews. And this one is no exception. It was an amazing conversation. Today, we are bringing you an interview with Dr. Gina Stamm, who specializes in so many, she has a great CV of all the things she's written about, but a lot of intersectional feminist issues in France. And it was really difficult to pin down because there's so much to talk about there, right? So yes, the conversation became a two-parter.
Not my fault this time.
It was not your fault, but it was such a wonderful conversation, and I had so many other questions. So hopefully Gina will come back because it's just complicated. It's so complex, and there is so much going on. And we asked these broad questions that were obviously much...
It was like a 101 course. Condensed down to 2 episodes. And she is a wealth of knowledge. It's obvious this is her specialty. She's written books on it, and she continues to teach and lecture on it. So everything, it was so informative. And I'm like, yeah, I need to take notes. So for those of you listening and want to learn things, take your time. This might have to be a re-listen because there's so much. That she provides in information, and then just kind of like in comparison to what's happening in the U.S. and just in general when it comes to the feminist movement. So it's a lot.
It is a lot. And she broke it down so beautifully. So in this first part is much more of a foundational, like you said, kind of a here's our context. Here's how we got to where we are. The second part, we're going to talk more about a lot of the more recent issues around women and feminism in France. So that'll be out next week. So keep your ear tuned. Be on the lookout for that. This is our job. We're professionals.
This is fine.
Yes. But it's really, you need to listen to both because it's fascinating to see how the history and then where we are. And there's so much going on. So yes, keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, let us get into our interview with Gina. And today we are so happy to be joined by friend of the show. I'm already going to call you friend of the show. Gina. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
So my name is Gina Stamm. I use a she or they. And I am Associate Professor of French at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And I have to do the little disclaimer now where anything that I am about to say is purely my own opinion and does not represent the views of my employer. And I have a PhD in French studies, which means broadly literature and culture from Emory University, with focuses on comparative literature and psychoanalytic studies, which will probably come up a little bit later. And my research focuses on environmental humanities, speculative literature, and feminism. And I also am a freelance literary translator.
Ooh, you should come back on and talk about that. I would love to hear more about that.
I would love to come and talk about that.
Yes, I was looking at your CV right before this, and you've written about so many topics. And we had a hard time when we were discussing what we would talk about on this episode because there's so much. But I guess to begin, can you give us kind of the basics, some context of the history of feminism in France, of women in France?
Okay, so I'm going to do something really pedantic and say we have to first talk about what we mean by France and what we mean by women. Here, when we think about France, we think about it as European, but it's an empire, and it's been an empire for several hundred years. There are territories that are part of France that are in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and in the South Pacific. And prior to the mid-20th century, that also included large parts of Africa and Southeast Asia as well. And when you talk about women and women's rights and feminist movements, a lot of that women's rights, as they were acquired in Europe and then later in the Caribbean, just didn't apply to those colonial territories, which were in general, that was under what was known as the Indigenous Code, which meant a separate set of laws, what we would now recognize as a system of Jim Crow or apartheid. The Caribbean's always had a little bit of a separate status, and now the Caribbean territories, as well as Mayotte, are known as departments. So they're like the status that we know as Hawaii, and then there are other more or less. And then you also have the overseas territories, which have a whole other system. So what civic and civil rights you have access to varies. And what do we mean by women? A lot of the data that we have will be aggregated because you cannot use public funds or as a public servant track any ethnic or racial data in France, because these are not legal concepts. And the idea was sort of to say, well, race doesn't exist, therefore we're not going to recognize it. But what that means in practice is that there are inequities that don't have good data, both by ethnicity, immigration status. You've got a little bit more in terms of social class and in terms of regional differences. But in France, you have the sort of informational situation that we're now finding ourselves in, where the CDC data is taken down, the NIH data is taken down, that has anything to do with diversity. Although the current interior minister just said that he's favorable to gathering ethnic statistics as long as it's not used for positive discrimination, all of that in heavy air quotes, which means what kind of discrimination is it going to be used for? It's not great. But on the other hand, it is a very centralized government, which means that you don't have the differences state to state that you might have in the US. So, and also when we talk about women, so there is going to be racial and ethnic disparities that I just simply don't have the data to address, although there are some smaller and like non-governmental organizations that do get some. But also when you talk about women, it's like, well, we are going to talk about maternal health and things like that. And no, that's not all women. And we are going to talk about queer issues, and that's not all women. But having resources for people who want to be mothers or for people who want alternative romantic relationships, that means that affects the choices that are available to everybody. Let's put it that way. I'm sure you've talked about this all the time. So, but I just wanted to be really clear here. We're also talking about both civic and civil rights. So civil rights in terms of access to education, access to professional lives, freedom of speech, freedom to appear in public spaces, things like that. Or also civic rights in terms of voting and in terms of being able to present yourself for elections as well. And in terms of both of those, there are a lot of parallels between France and the US, UK, so things you might be more familiar with. And just to set a sort of baseline also in terms of how we might compare material situations, general measures of women's material well-being are higher in France. Their life expectancy right now is about 5 years higher than in the US. And they're in the 2016-2018 maternal mortality rates, for example, are 22 in 100,000 in the US and 8 in 100,000 in France. And that's gotten much worse in the US since Roe has been overturned. So the comparison is even starker now. And in terms of violence against women, that's something that I want to address later on. But so I do want to be clear. There are a lot of things that I'm going to say that are quite negative about the situation in France. But I will also want to recognize that, especially when it comes to access to healthcare and things like that, it's uniformly a much better situation. So in terms of history, the sort of history of women's rights, 18th century, you get some forerunners, same as in the US, UK. You especially get a woman named Olympe de Gouges, who wrote a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. That's around the time of the French Revolution. There are other female intellectuals around that time. She's kind of the number one, and she was also an abolitionist. Throughout the 19th century, you get a growing women's suffrage movement and a push for more civil rights, not civic rights for women, but civil rights, especially when it comes to control of their own finances and property and abilities to divorce and have control of their or have custody of their children. And people who are really big figures in that are a woman named Flora Tristan, who was a Franco-Peruvian woman who was sort of, because of her situation, she wound up divorced, no custody of her children, disinherited, but she became a socialist activist who did a lot of data collection around the working class in France and also a lot of work for women's rights as well. And this is something that's really, that is a distinction between the US and France, is that a lot of the early women's rights movement came out of the working class and was in conjunction with working class industrial activism and not as much the sort of middle class Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony kind of thing we'll see in the US. Two other big figures I just want to mention real quickly. Hubertine Auclair, who was a journalist and a suffragist. She's the first person to use feminist that we know of, to use the word feminist as a positive thing. It was originally a medical diagnosis to say that effeminate boys, which is a bad thing in medicine at the time, they are feminists. And then it was used pejoratively by Alexandre Dumas, the son, to talk about, oh, these feminists who want women's rights. But Hubertine Auclair is the first one to say, no, really, we are feminists and we want to be feminists. And Madeleine Pelletier, who was a psychiatrist, a socialist, a suffragist, and an abortion rights activist who she was born in 1874, died in 1939. She was really big in integrating women into the workers' rights and socialist organizations in the early 20th century. And she was, even though she'd had a stroke and was paralyzed, she was accused of providing an abortion and wound up being interned in a psychiatric hospital and dying in 1939. So not great. Wonderful figure, not a great situation.
No.
So in the late 19th and early 20th century, though, there's a lot of progress piecemeal in terms of civil rights, in terms of access, ability to work without permission, access to bank accounts, being able to be in control of your own salary. That was 1907, for example. So you have certain schools that'll open up to women, certain professions that you can, and it's really just baby steps, kind of. Around World War I, you have the beginnings of what will become maternal leave and subsidies for mothers. And the reasoning around this is really interesting. And I think it's something to point out because it does come up a lot around any kind of reproductive rights issue in France. And there's this huge anxiety about population decline. This starts in the 1870s after the Franco-Prussian War, and it kicks into super high gear after World War I, when you have just the decimation of the adult male population. So there's this provision of subsidies and maternal leave and eventually protections for pregnant women in the workforce and things like that are to encourage women to have as many babies as possible. And this is specifically framed as a kind of as national policy, not as personal rights or protections. This is going to come up again a couple of years ago because demographic decline, as we've seen from certain people in our own country, there's a lot of anxiety, and specifically demographic decline of people of European ancestry. And the current French president will bring this up again when he talks about the need for a quote unquote demographic rearmament, and will say that the government is going to start offering fertility tests for every 25-year-old. This is not law yet, but this was what he proposed. So this is an anxiety that goes back very far, and it's going to determine a lot of the policy that comes after in a way that is maybe the undertone of U.S. policy, but not necessarily. Until very recently, there's been a tendency to not say that quiet part out loud in the U.S. So in 1944, post-World War II, that's when women get the right to vote. So it's quite a bit later than in the U.S. And this is specifically couched as in recognition of the part that they played in the resistance. So 1944, that's when they have a referendum that sets up their next constitution. And in the Constitution of 1946, that's when the right to vote is actually sort of enshrined in law. And also, that's when they get what is the equivalent of an equal rights amendment. What that means in practice is super problematic, but in the language has been there since 1946. In 1960, you get the Family Planning Association, which is the sort of Planned Parenthood equivalent. And you also get the first laws around prostitution that are meant to protect sex workers. So what we would think of as human trafficking laws, selling other people's sex work starts then. Prostitution, personal prostitution, remains legal until, I want to say 2016, but actually I didn't write that down. But it was weird. It happened. I was there the week it happened, and it was a very strange. The landscape changed.
Yeah.
So in 1971, this is when things sort of kick into high gear in terms of addressing women's rights as women's rights. You get a very famous open letter called the Manifesto of the 343, which is a manifesto signed by 343 mostly public figures, some private citizens, but mostly public figures, saying that they have had an abortion. And it caused a lot of public blowback, but it is one of the things that led in 1974. So we just had the 50th anniversary of what's called the McVey law, which is the law decriminalizing abortion, and it's named after the health minister at the time. So the framing of this is very different than in the US because it's not framed as a right to privacy in the way it is under substantive due process in the US. It is framed as a question of social equity, because rich women are always going to have access to safe abortions. They can go to Switzerland, they can go to the UK. And then poorer women, working class women, are going to be forced into very unsafe situations. So this is framed as a social equity issue. And it's also within the law, there are also a bunch of incentives to have children that are being added to sort of quiet down that anxiety of, what if we allow abortion? Will that cut our birth rate?
Mm-hmm.
There's a giant asterisk here, which is that abortion was not only legal, but being forced on many people in the overseas territories, specifically in Reunion, where, like, we know this from US history and Canadian, where forced sterilization of marginalized populations was taking place. In Reunion, there's a long history of forced sterilization and abortion. Like, women would come in for a separate health problem, and they'd be like, oh, you need a procedure, and abort, and then sterilize them. There's a book on this by an author, Françoise Vergès, called The Wombs of Women, Race, Capital, and Feminism, which documents this really well. It came out in a court case at the time, but that book is much more recent. But since this time, the abortion laws have evolved. So it went from 10 weeks originally. Now it's at 14 for like standard, no questions asked abortion. It's covered by the national insurance. It's illegal to impede someone from getting an abortion. And in 2016, the waiting period was abolished in medical abortion. So the pill was allowed. Unfortunately, this is one of the areas where it's been the far right, which is now very close to being in government, has articulated its desire to revisit this. In 1972, you get an Equal Pay Act, but the outcome of that is not great. So in 2021, for a woman working in the private sector, annual salary is 18,630 euros. For men, it's 24,640. A lot of this has to do with the fact that women get, because of the uneven distribution of household tasks and childcare, often you wind up in lower paid jobs There's also discrimination in employment, which is illegal, but happens, obviously. And many women are forced to only work part-time because of their childcare obligations. So the National Institutes, and I want to think it's economic and something statistics, I just blanked on what that acronym means. It's INSEE. If you measure equal time, same job, same company, the disparity is 4.3%. But there are huge disparities in what work you do for whom and whether it's full-time or part-time. 1975, mutual consent divorce was allowed. And as of 2 weeks ago, you can no longer divorce your partner for not having sex with you. So this was what was known legally as the conjugal duty. So it is part of your job as in theory, it's not gendered, but in theory, your conjugal duty as a spouse is to have sex with a person. But the European Court of Human Rights 2 weeks ago said that this is not consistent with how we understand consent, because if saying, I will divorce you and leave you in potentially a precarious situation if you don't have sex with me, is not considered by the European Court of Human Rights to be acceptable.
2 weeks ago. Wow.
Yeah, that's 2 weeks ago.
Small steps.
Yeah. And marital rape was outlawed in 1992. So 1980 is when rape as such became a crime, separate from just assault. And you do have pretty robust laws in terms of sexual harassment, revenge porn, and online gender-based harassment, but the enforcement of those is extremely patchy, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. Getting to the end of this timeline, in 2000, a law that insisted on parity for when you're a political party, you're supposed to present lists that have an equal number of men and women or pay a penalty. There are a couple of problems with that. One is that this recognizes that, so you're not allowed to give any kind of quota system for race because that would be admitting that people are different. But it's okay to say that men and women are different kinds of people. Yes, there's some inconsistencies there that will, I'm sure, get me yelled at online. But also, a lot of parties prefer to pay the penalty. So right now you have 36% of the Chamber of Deputies, which is the main legislative chamber, that are women. Again, doing better than the U.S., 28.7% for U.S. Congress. In 2011, the Istanbul Convention on Gender Equality is adopted by France. So this is a convention in Europe which says that defines gender as socially dependent rules and norms based on sex. And it requires that all signatories adopt laws concerning gender-based violence. So that's how you wind up with these robust legal protections for sexual harassment, discrimination, etc. But then what is actually the outcome to that law being passed? 2013, you get marriage for all, so marriage that includes same-sex couples. And in 2021, you get what's called the bioethics law, which extends fertility treatment and what they call medically assisted pregnancy, so that could be anything from artificial insemination to in vitro, to single women and same-sex couples. The surrogacy is still uniformly outlawed. We're not in the situation like Italy just did, where they said, we will not recognize children born of surrogacy in other countries where it's legal. So we're not there, but that has been proposed by some people on the far right.
Not recognized? Like they don't exist here?
They don't exist. They don't have Italian citizenship. They're not your kid.
Okay.
Wow.
They're illusions. They're ghosts. Okay.
Yes,
good to
essentially.
know.
Italy is a whole other thing right now.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm laughing, but that probably will happen in the US too. So
it's terrifying. I say nonchalantly.
Yeah.
So both in terms of the marriage for all and the bioethics law, there are a couple of weird backlashes that happen. One is sort of the expected backlash from the right, and especially from the religious right, which is smaller in France than it is in the US, although it's growing. And that took the form of what was called, so they're like, marriage for all, we're the march for all. We're going to make this huge demonstration full of vile homophobic rhetoric and like promote some really awful ideas around same-sex couples. But then on the traditional left, you get a kind of objection that you did not see around these issues in the US. And that is a sort of pseudoscientific objection in terms of, can children of homoparental couples be, one, okay, and two, good citizens? So I'm coming as someone who is not hostile to psychoanalysis. There are many kinds of psychoanalysis, but there is a popular perception of it that somehow takes root in a certain intellectual class where there was a proliferation, including from a socialist deputy on the floor of the legislature, saying, but how will a child resolve their Oedipus complex if they don't have a father and a mother? So you can Google Oedipus complex resolved marriage for all and see article, like from very respectable publications. I am not going to say psychoanalysis has been debunked. The Oedipus complex has been debunked. That is a description of a specific situation that happened in a specific set of people in a specific class in Vienna. As a description, I'm not going to argue with it. I wasn't there. I don't know. I'm sure it can occur as a group dynamic. But to prescribe that as something that needs to happen in order, and because the family, the nuclear family as the hearth of the republic, is specious and, as an American, a bit shocking coming from the left. And that rhetoric has, I mean, in many ways, there's been a toleration of homosexuality as a practice, but not as an identity, that I think pervades the political discourse around homosexuality, around homoparental families, and now around transgender issues. That is absent largely from the US debate. It's on the fringes of the UK. But that's something I just want to flag as being quite particular to this situation. And then I'm going to come back to this, but in 2024, the freedom to have an abortion was added to the Constitution. And I will come back to that in sort of the current events section at the end, but that's where we are.
Whoa.
In terms of feminism, so political or social movements, I can give you a much shorter rundown. So 1949, you get Simone de Beauvoir publishing The Second Sex. So this is where you get the very famous quote, "One is not born a woman, one becomes one." So it's really showing the identity of woman to be a social construction that overlays certain biological characteristics. However, that text is not perfect. There's a lot of very deeply internalized misogyny in there, including talking about how women, because they don't have access to the public sphere, have yet to write a truly great novel because they're only writing about women's issues. And which seems to sort of say women's issues can't be of general interest. Domestic issues cannot be of general interest. Mm-hmm. In 1970, you get the foundation of the women's liberation movement. And that actually is rooted quite deeply in both in traditional Marxist, socialist, communist activism in France. So looking at social inequalities, looking at who has the material resources and how they exploit other people's labor and bodies. And also in the US women's movement. The Betty Friedan's feminine mystique made a big impact on French feminism as well. And in the US, we have a tendency to be like first wave, second wave plus. It's a little bit different in France. It's a little bit more fragmented. So you get this women's liberation movement. They're big in terms of, this is right around the time that abortion is decriminalized, and they're very instrumental in that. But you get a couple of different splits within the movement that happen. One is you get the more politically oriented, almost all sociologists or novelists who identify first as revolutionary feminists. And then you get a group that splits off who are very rooted in psychoanalytic practice. And these are people who become your sort of differentialist feminists who are really looking at women and men and sexual difference as being sort of a very constitutive psychological formation. The other problem with them is that their leader, Antoinette Fouque, trademarked women's liberation movement and then started a press so it basically kind of sucked all the air out of the room. For financial reasons, honestly, because that press was getting a lot of the financial resources and promoting their specific strain of feminism. That press still exists. It's really broadened its scope. It's become much friendlier to a lot of different kinds of feminists, but it is rooted in that original split. And then you have a split between the materialist feminists on one side. So you get them, and then the revolutionary feminists who start to describe themselves as materialists. And there's sort of three precepts in this. One, that gender precedes sex, that the idea that we need to divide people into two kinds of people it's not just that we have two biological sexes and then gender is sort of on top of that, but the need to divide people into two groups precedes our understanding of who's in those two groups. Two, that they understand women's oppression from a material standpoint, access to resources, exploitation of bodies, and they are explicitly revolutionary. They want to change society from the ground up. But then in 1981, they have a big sort of breakup because there are a group within that, Monique Wittig, who I work a lot with, she's the author of The Straight Mind, and which is one of these early texts that talks about sort of compulsory heterosexuality. It's really questioning the necessity for it and whether heterosexuality as an institution, whether you can have that without an exploitative relationship. And so there's this group, her, but not exclusively her, that are saying our identity as lesbians is a political identity, and we are fighting not just for women's rights, but also for the right to be lesbians. And there's another group that says, no, what you're doing is too particular. It isn't a political identity. And this includes women who were lesbians, but said, that's not a political part of my identity. That's just a thing I do. And so there's a split in the middle of the group that actually winds up with Monique Wittig going to the US and teaching in colleges in the US because it became almost impossible for her to publish in France. Then you get this weird American creation called French feminism, that is largely a university philosophical discourse, made up of the triumvirate of Hélène Cixous, Luce Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva. And there's someone named Kate Costello who's written a pretty great thesis about how this is this constitution of feminism. Even though those people didn't really have a political agenda, they're mostly talking about sort of what it is to be a woman. And this gets sort of crystallized in the American university system as French feminism, while ignoring a lot of the political activity that these other people had done on the ground. There's kind of been a turnaround in the last 5 years, but still is kind of like this. One last figure is a woman named Françoise Daubonne, who's the inventor of the word ecofeminism. So she wrote a lot about how women and the non-human are both sort of the objects of exploitation, like physical appropriation by the dominant patriarchal capitalist class. And the other side of this is that environmental degradation falls harder in many ways on people who are identified as women. When you think about climate refugees, when we think about accumulation of toxic substances in body tissues, things like that. And that was in the 70s. It kind of goes, you don't see that a lot until 1993 when a bunch of English language people pick it up and run with it. And then again, this is experiencing a resurgence. Sorry, that was very long, but it is.
Don't
you
apologize.
Gave us the whole history that we needed, and please don't give us a quiz because I will fail, especially with the names. I was like, this is where I know French is not my language because I have no idea what we're saying. The names, I'm like, oh, I would be so bad at that. But I loved like that information. It is obviously you are a professor and you're a good one at that. So all of those things. So I felt like I need to be taking notes. I'm like, I'm not. Where am I? Okay, yes. And this timeline, because you did such an amazing job in laying that out. And it was very like that haunting familiarity in it all is like, oh God.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You know, it's so many of these things just don't go away.
It's true. And it was a huge ask. We knew it when we were like, just break down and very briefly what happened
Tell
in
us
this
about
whole...
France. That's the entire thing. Tell us all about France and women. And then the marginalized too. Let's add all those things.
So thank you so much for that. But that brings us to today. There is a lot to talk about still. And one of the things I was interested in when we were workshopping topics is you mentioned the visibility and valuation of women in public life in France. Could you break that down for us?
Okay, so the biggest sort of symbolic place where you see this is in the Pantheon. So that's this big monument. It's a big mausoleum in the center of Paris. And it was designed as a church, but now it's where they bury people who are considered to have been like the great men of the nation. And there are 81 people in it, and 7 of them are women, and 3 of them have gone in the last decade. So one, that proportion is, and also that the question of who has the right to be put in there when you're a woman, I mean, at all, because that's a big question. But so the women who are in there, you've got Sophie Berthelot, who was a chemist in the 19th century, but she's in there because her husband's in there, and she and her husband wanted to be buried together. There's Marie Curie. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that one.
Right. That's going to be my one guess.
Yeah. There are 3 significant members of the resistance. So a woman named Germaine Tillon, Geneviève de Gaulle-Anthonioz, and Mélinée Manoukian. There's Simone Weil, she was the health minister that proposed the law legalizing abortion and a number of other important laws. And she survived the concentration camps during World War II. And there's Josephine Baker. And Josephine Baker is really complicated because, one, she's the only woman of color in there. And she did become a French citizen. And she did do a great deal of service to the nation. She was a resistant. She was a spy for the French resistance. She was a humanitarian. But there are a couple of issues with that. One is that there's an overvaluation of American people of color and African Americans as compared to people of color who come from the French former colonial empire. And which means that she's there, but a bunch of other people are not. And the other issues with that are that she never criticized the French colonies in Africa, for example. So you have some people who could be there. There's a woman named Louise Michel who was a revolutionary, a school teacher, an all-around badass, if you want to look up Louise Michel. But she was staunchly anti-colonialist. You have Suzanne Césaire, who's the poet and politician Aimé Césaire's wife, who was a fantastic writer in her own right. She's been getting her flowers recently from university people, but she hasn't gotten the public or political recognition. You have the Nardal sisters, who were Martinican women who started the first Black salon, literary salon, in the early 20th century in Paris, and were writers in their own right. And specifically, you have a woman named Gisèle Halimi. So she was of Tunisian Jewish origins, and she is enormous in French history. So she became known because she defended an Algerian resistant woman named Jamila Boupasha in 1960, who was tortured and raped by French soldiers during the Algerian Revolution. She was one of the lawyers in the Bobigny trial, which was a trial in 1972 of doctors who had provided abortions. And they were acquitted, and this is one of the other things that led up to the legalization. She was one of the three lawyers in what's called the Plongée Castellano affair, which is between 1974 and 1978, a major case where a lesbian couple was gang raped. And this is how rape became a separate legal category and punishment in France. And she was also, because she was also an elected official, she was at the origin of the law that abolished. So you used to have in France where you had the age of consent, and then you had the age of consent if you were gay. And you had to be an adult, like for a while it was 21, in order to have gay sex, when the age of consent for heterosexual sex was 15.
There's so many questions.
Yeah. And I would also like to mention that a couple of the people that are currently in the cabinet in France voted to keep that distinction in the 80s. So Gisèle Halimi, huge, enormous critic of the French government. Is she going to get in the pantheon? I don't know. She hasn't been dead that long, but they don't seem positive to the idea. So the picking of a woman who is a woman of color, but who was not critical of the France's imperial possessions and their treatment of their subjects, versus one who did so much for French women and for equality overall in France, but who was extremely critical. So you get it. So in the opening ceremony of the Olympics last year, you had a little bit of a corrective, and I want to absolutely say congratulations to Marjorie, the guy who created that whole spectacle. He did a good job in many ways. It's unfortunately, I think, a lot of window dressing, but I don't want to take anything away from him or the efforts that he made. And he made these statues come out of the Seine of women who had not been recognized. So Simone Weil was in there, but you also have, but he had Gisèle Halimi, so this lawyer. He had Paulette Nardal, so one of the women who ran the salon, an athlete, a filmmaker, Louise Michel, the revolutionary, Christine de Pizan, who was a medieval poet who wrote a lot about women's role in society. And then, unfortunately, Jeanne Barré, who was the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, but she was also a huge colonizer. That opening ceremony also brought up the prevalence of misogynoir in public spaces against the singer Aya Nakamura, who she was dressed in gold and doing the song with the brass band on the bridge. The reaction of the right to her being asked to sing was abject. So she is French of immigration. A background that includes immigration, but she is French. She sings in French. And they said, well, we should have someone who really represents France, like Celine Dion or Lara Fabian. Neither of those are French.
Right.
And then they said, one of them's Canadian. I think Lara Fabian's Belgian, but I'm not sure. And then they said, and I can't remember exactly which person this was who. I think it was Marine Le Pen, but I can't be 100% sure. But then she was like, well, she doesn't sing in French. And it was pointed out that, yes, in fact, she sings in French. What other language do you think she sings in? And she said, and this person said, in Foreigner. And this is in a televised. And this kind of misogynoir, so misogyny that is accentuated and exacerbated by the fact that a woman who is Black is in public, is also evident in the treatment of the most recent winner of Star Academy, which is like the American Idol version. So Ebony, who's from the Caribbean, and the just wave of hate that she got online, as well as against the current Miss France, when she wouldn't say, I am Charlie. So this is in reference to the attacks a decade ago on Charlie Hebdo, the newspaper. Charlie Hebdo suffered a really terrible attack on its personnel. However, Charlie Hebdo has a tradition of running tremendously Islamophobic and misogynistic content, especially editorial cartoons. In the last year, they ran an editorial cartoon that showed Giselle Pellico, the victim of the mass rape trial that we'll probably talk about later. It was a satire of Emmanuel Macron taking advantage of the French people by ignoring the results of the election that took place over the summer. But it was drawn as the gang rape of Giselle Pellico. It's so terrible. And so for her to be like, I don't really want to say I'm Charlie, man. But then in an interview, she didn't make reference to that exactly, but there are a lot of reasons not to say it. Or not to identify oneself with that publication. And she also received a lot of online hate. There's also a huge moral panic around the hijab, so the veil that Muslim women wear. And this goes back a long time, but specifically in 2004, that's when they made a law saying you can't wear ostentatious religious signs in a public education establishment. So in theory, this is not attacking any particular religion, but the idea of what constitutes ostentatious. If you have a cross or a Star of David, is that ostentatious? And what this has come to mean in practice is the exclusion, gradually, of more and more women wearing veils from public space. And this is a quite extreme interpretation of the way separation of church and state is written into the Constitution there. And I should also note that this doesn't apply to nuns, because that's a cultural garment and not a...
I love that they have like specifics.
France was the only country to ban its Olympic athletes from wearing a headscarf. Every year there's a moral panic around the burkini, so the full body swimming outfit. Mm-hmm. And then specifically there, in the last couple of years, there was the abaya affair. So that's a traditional long garment that's worn in a number of Middle Eastern and North African countries. And there was an elementary school that had an elegance day. So the students were supposed to wear their nicest clothes. Well, for a lot of those students, that means they're traditional garments. So there were young girls, 10, 11, showing up in abayas, long, beautiful, embroidered dresses. And this was seen as a sign of that it was a religious garment. It's not particularly a religious garment. It is more ethnic than religious, or geographically distributed than religious. While it is sometimes associated with modest dressing, it's a long dress. And these girls were forced to take off their abayas and just be in like their leggings. And it was, it's super gross. Mm-hmm. And then there's this explosion of there's like, oh, the abaya is banned in school, but then it's like, where does it stop being a long dress and start being an abaya? And there are all these examples of people being like, so is this banned? And they're like, oh, that's horrible. And then they're like, it's Gucci. Like,
it costs a lot of money. Why?
Yeah. And then you get like Brigitte Macron doing a state dinner, and she's dressed up to here, long dress, sleeves down to here. Where's the difference there? But then you get a situation where you've had students in middle school having their skirts measured to make sure they're not too long.
Wow.
So, but at the same time, you also have a public polemic against girls wearing crop tops to school. And the amazing phrase that was, I don't have the government minister who said it, but he said, all they have to do is dress in a Republican manner.
Oh,
not Republican in the American sense, but like in the sense as good citizens. And it's like, what on earth does that mean? How I dress and how much skin I show affect my ability to be a good citizen? And then you also get, on mainstream television platforms, you also get older men saying, but girls that age should be showing their shapes. And it's like, for whom? For whom, sir?
Wow, an actual gasp.
So there's a book that came out that I think is sort of instructive here, and I don't think there's an English translation yet, but the title is Always Too Much or Not Enough.
Right.
And it's about, the public discourse around women's clothing, but especially around young and teenage girl clothing as well. So, and there's also this really wonderful ecofeminist woman with a political science background called Fatima Waisek, who wrote a book. She's written several books. One of them, the main one, is called For a Pirate Ecology. And that one is being translated. I don't know who's doing it, but I know that there is a translation in English that's happening. But she has talked about how there's effectively this way in which people, working class people of immigration background, especially if they have any signs of belonging to especially to the Islamic tradition, are in many ways kept out of public spaces. And especially when this comes to young people, young women, in terms of them not being allowed to dress how they want, but also young men because they're perceived as a threat. And she's also talked about how like the environmental conditions in working class neighborhoods add to this idea that you're confined to your home because it's not safe or healthy to be outside. And she's talked about specifically what it feels like to her to be a mother who is visibly North African and Muslim, and the ways in which she can't show up for her children without being accused of being an Islamicist. As in, specifically, what this came out of the incident was that she's a vegetarian, her children are vegetarians, she's an ecologist, she's background political scientist in political ecology. And she's like, I want my children to have the option to eat a vegetarian meal in the public school. And she shows up and they say, what you're trying to do is to get halal into the public school. And there's this whole controversy over whether it's legitimate for her as a North African woman to ask for what other French women can ask for, because there are public schools where there is a vegetarian option, but those are predominantly white, non-Muslim. So there's that kind of situation where it's like, can you advocate for yourself as a Muslim, as a North African or Arab woman? And there's also sort of, I can't give you good data about this, but there is the sort of body policing and clothing policing. It's really intense for everyone. but it affects women specifically as women. You have a situation about a decade ago where a socialist minister, she'd been criticized for wearing jeans and a blazer to an official meeting because that wasn't formal enough. So she's like, fine, I'm going to put on a dress. And she wore this flowered, like it was like a, Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress style, whatever, like something and she went to speak in the National Assembly and was catcalled.
What?
Yeah.
Oh.
And there have been men who've worn, something a little avant-garde and gotten made fun of, but not catcalled, not wolf whistled. And then there's also the idea, because when we think of France, we think of fashion, we think of very thin people. And there is what I don't think she came up with this, but recently the author Louise Morel was talking about the injunction to thinness. And how, as Westerners, we live in a very fat phobic society in general, but that it isn't just, even people who are in thin bodies are constantly being sort of reminded that they better not step out of line.
Mm-hmm.
Like she, for example, she was like, I've been in a thin body my entire life. I'm maybe heavier now than I was ever, but still considered within a normal range in any other country, not France. And I spent 2 years eating nothing but clementines as a teenager. Like, that's not exclusive to France, but the sort of intensity in public spaces and the constant, like, advertisement of, I mean, this is cranked up with social media everywhere in terms of like weight loss products. I mean, I can't get on Instagram now without being advertised as Ozempic and everything else. But in terms of, it's been there for a really long time and in a very, very visible way.
Whew. Yeah, that is a lot. That is a lot. And I know we're going to come back to some of that at the end, but I did want to ask you, just because I have taken many, many years of French. It is a gendered language. Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned that, this is also part of this conversation, I just want to learn more about that. Can you tell us how it relates?
Yeah. So French is a gendered language. Every noun is either masculine or feminine. And so in English is not a heavily gendered language, but we do have pronouns that are gendered. That's become a hot topic recently. And in France, it's not just pronouns, it's nouns, and then all of the adjectives that agree with all of those nouns. So there is some flexibility in this because, like, if I say I am XYZ, I have to make a choice whether I'm going to gender those down the line, and how I'm going to do it. And so traditionally, I would make all of it. Like, if I said I am a, happy perfectionist, like all of those like things, I would have to tack on a feminine ending to those. And you can get around this a little bit if you say, because person as a noun is feminine, whether it's referring to a man or a woman. Person is just feminine. So I could say, like, I am a person who is, and then all of them would be feminine, and that has no reflection on my gender. But that requires a lot of gymnastics. There's one novel that did it really well. It's a novel called Sphinx by Anne Garretta. There's a translation in English that doesn't quite have the same oomph, but it's a novel where the two protagonists, you can't tell what gender they are. Like, it's managed to completely sidestep this issue. But in general, it's quite a heavily gendered language, and it also has a governing body of that language called the Académie Française. That is so when we think about dictionaries, like you have the Oxford English Dictionary, Webster's Dictionary, whatever, these are primarily descriptive linguistic bodies that say, how are people using these words? Let's put this in the dictionary, and so that people know how they are being used. The Académie Française is prescriptive in that it says, this is the word you should use for this situation in this way. These are the rules of grammar. This is not legally binding, but this is what sort of directs educational policy and style guides and things like that. And they are very slow to change. And they are traditionally, up until the 60s, they were all men. They are still mostly men. And this comes into play for a lot of reasons. And one of them is when it comes to professional nouns that are the names of professions. Because traditionally, there was no question, like if I said I'm a professor, I'm a doctor, those are, like for a long time, only men were those things. So there was no, like, why bother having a different form? But then the question comes up when women start occupying these positions, do I want to have the exact same title as a man? Which is one argument. Or, and that's the what we've done in English pretty much, when we, instead of saying actress, we say actor, so everybody gets the same one. Or do I want to make sure everyone knows I am a woman in that job so that we can make it visible that there are women in that job? And so in 1998, there was a parliamentary rule change that said, okay, any job you have in parliament, there's a feminine form that we can use for that. And the Academy would occasionally come out with some very dismissive statement about this. In 2014, they put out a very wishy-washy statement where they described feminized profession names as barbarisms, because they're like, there's no way to really do this within the rules of French, so it comes up with something really ugly. But they were like, well, if the people involved really want this, then I guess, sure, fine, whatever. And that was also the year where you had a very public dispute. So the person presiding the National Assembly, so not the French president, but the person who was sort of organizationally in charge of the National Assembly, was a woman named Sandrine Mazetier. And there was a conservative deputy, so legislator, who insisted on calling her Madame le Président. So, Madame, the masculine president. And she was like, nah, man, it is Madame la Présidente to you. and he kept going, because he was like, no, the la Présidente is the president's wife, because traditionally these feminine forms were the wife of whatever. Mm-hmm. And I'm just following the French Academy's rules. And he wound up being fined, because what he was doing was breaching parliamentary procedure, because there had been this circular that was like, no, in government, we are feminizing the professions. And then in 2017, finally, there was a government circular that mandated the official use of feminized professions in any official document. So author is one of those where it's like, are we going to tack on an E, so it's auteur or auteur with an E, or are we going to have the autrice, like an actor, actress, and say auteur, autrice? And so there's some sort of, not confusion necessarily, but it hasn't really been settled which one is in uniform use. And then you also have the situation where in a mixed group, masculine is considered to be the neutral. So if I said men and women, then I would use masculine adjectives down the line to refer to the whole group. And the argument has often been like, well, it's not really about gender. That's just how it's always been. It has not always been like that. It's been like that since the 16th century. Before that, you actually had a lot of flexibility. Are you going to use just the masculine? Are you going to use an adjective that agrees with the one that's closest in the sentence? Are you going to use the adjective that agrees, like if there are more women than men, then you could use a feminine adjective. Like there wasn't, until the establishment of the French Academy, there wasn't an established usage by which you would only use the masculine to represent the neutral. And a lot of times people get around this by saying, like, if instead of saying, like, welcome all, I'd be like, welcome all masculine and all feminine. But then you get two issues there where you're like, well, you're separating them and that seems weird. And also, what about people who don't feel comfortable within either of those things? So you have an effort to do what's called inclusive spelling, or that both covers mixed groups, but it also covers non-binary individuals or people of indeterminate gender. Like if you don't know whether a person is, like if, like the author of this piece, you don't know whether it's a man or a woman or a non-binary person. The French establishment is so astonishingly hostile to this. So there are various ways you can do it. There's been a lot of experimentation. Are we going to say masculine ending, period, feminine ending? Are we just going to say masculine ending, feminine ending? Are we going to say masculine ending / feminine ending? What are we going to do with this? It's sort of come down on the masculine ending, period, feminine ending when you have a mixed group, and then there are also, when it comes to pronouns, like all as a pronoun. So you have tous, T-O-U-S, that's masculine. And then you have toutes, T-O-U-T-E-S, feminine. And then you have a combined form that is in more common use now among people who use the inclusive spelling, which is toust, T-O-U-S-T-E-S. Wouldn't seem like a huge problem. For some people, it very much is. The president, Emmanuel Macron specifically, has been very vocal about how he wants to preserve the traditional beauty of the French language, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also have really interesting things going on where you have people in the graphic design world who are working on, and I can show you this. I know it's an audio medium, but I just wanted to show you this. This is non-binary typography. And so this is from two people, one of whom I've met. They're very lovely. So Eugénie Bidot and Camille Circlude, and they're part of a collective called Bye Bye Binary. And they make these stencils, but they also make fonts that you can plug into your word processor so you can type in gender neutral. And they're also people who are the first examples of people that I met who were really good at pronouncing it, the double endings, because it is something you do have to get used to. It's not automatic, but nothing is in language. And one of the issues that people bring up with the inclusive spelling, they're like, well, it's going to be harder for people with dyslexia. There's been one study, a fairly large study, but just one study so far that's looking at neurodivergent people, and specifically people with learning disabilities related to writing and reading and inclusive spelling. And with the exception of one font that was more difficult, with enough preparation, like exposure to it, there was no statistically significant difference in their ability to read the inclusive spelling versus the non-inclusive spelling. And then there's also so in terms of pronouns, there was also a lot of back and forth about what do we want our gender neutral pronoun to be. It's kind of settled on IEL, I-E-L. So il is masculine, I-L, elle is feminine, E-L-L-E, and then IEL, I-E-L. And the survey, and I think it was 2023, showed that about 5% of French people between 15 and 24 identify as non-binary. So this isn't nothing. And so there's a lot of pushback, a lot of backlash from politicians, from the sort of traditional language community, but there are also a lot of people who want to use these.
I love that. I'm fascinated with language, so again, you'll have to come back and we'll talk more about this. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our interview with Gina. Like we said, in part 2, we're going to get into a lot more of the current issues, and including around like turfism in France, abortion, gender-based violence. So a lot of big topics. So look for that one next week. Make sure to listen. Thanks again to Gina for doing this, breaking this down for us, these huge questions. And special shout out to friend of the show, Lauren, who introduced us, who was like, you know who you should talk to over on SMNTY? I've got just the person. Well, listeners, if you have any thoughts about this or anything else, you can email us at hello@stuffmomnevertoldyou.com. You can find us on Blue Sky at Mom Stuff Podcast, or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff Mom Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks, as always, to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff Mom Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.